Okay, so I've never really stated this before on this channel, but like, there's actually reason to believe this because it is true. It's actually very true. If you ever played the 1997 Space World demo, there was one of the scrap Pokemon. There's this Pokemon called Parxe, and it's basically a stag beetle. Keep this in mind. It was a Pokemon that Heracross would evolve. Not Heracross. That was the Pokemon that Pinsir would evolve into. But the funny thing is, though, Parxe has never been in the final version. Because what had happened was Parxe, they took the evolution of not Paris, but yeah, Pinsir, not Paris. And Pinsir had its own evolution. Then eventually they'd give it a Mega Form evolution later on. I think this is why they did this. So Parxe was scrapped and recycled in like a Mega Evolution, but it was also, but more importantly, it was actually recycled in Heracross. Heracross was the exact same number, I do believe. So here's what's really interesting, though, and this is where I come up with this idea. If you actually play the 1997 Space World demo, and you make it all the way to the end, even though technically in the game's coding you couldn't, but with like cheats and all that you could. And if you play Pokemon Reforged, which mind you, the game was based on a bunch of prototype data, but it was carefully reconstructed so that way it would be finished. So it was what Pokemon Gold and Silver was originally supposed to be, but with beta assets. And then of course they scrapped it, and when Satoru Iwata came along, the guy that was the president of HAL at the time, and he was the last president of Nintendo of Japan. He wrote a bunch of compression algorithms that, he basically made it a lot easier to... He was also... They shouted him out in Pokemon Sun and Moon. They said that, this awesome guy came along and actually rewrote the game when they were kind of in a pinch at the time. And made it easier so that way they could fit more stuff into the Pokemon games. But what was really interesting is some people don't know this. I mean, recently, of course, they don't know this. But before Gold and Silver was created and the Kanto region was kind of like in a certain spot, Red was actually the 8th gym leader, believe it or not. And then there was actually like Gold would actually fight, you could fight Blue or Green, whatever you want to call them, was actually, well, technically even was the ex-champion, obviously. But I still think Red was technically stronger, even though he wasn't stronger in this version. But with the trainer rematches, I still do think Red was a stronger trainer than Blue and Green were. Blue/Green. But what's really interesting is in this version, Blue would use a Pokemon called Parxe. Again, the Pokemon that Pinsir would evolve into, not Paris, of course. And so it's a stag beetle, but then I guess they scrapped Parxe, they reworked it into Heracross, and Heracross is more like a Hercules stag beetle, if that makes sense. Yeah, it's a Hercules beetle. So they're kind of related, sort of, but different, though. So it's really interesting because in Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, you might remember how, like, in the second version, your rival leads off with a Heracross. And I wonder if that might have actually had something to do with, like, because he originally was, he actually used a Parxe in the original, and that Pokemon was no longer in the final version, and Heracross was obviously the final version. Because, in the final versions of Gen 2, Heracross was in it, and then finally when Gen 3 came along, Heracross was obviously in there too. Because if you don't know, if you forgot, Gen 3 went up to 386 Pokemon. It had Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3. And then we went from, so Gen 3 went from like 252 all the way up to 386. And originally it was supposed to be like 411 or something like that. But that's a whole other story, though. But whatever Pokemon were scrapped and which ones weren't, we'll have to look back at it. But it's interesting to think about, though. Because originally your rival had like, because what was really strange was... In the very first game, one of the beta ideas that they had was the champion actually had all 3 starters in their final version. And mind you, Squirtle actually had a final evolution that wasn't originally Blastoise. That originally was Tortle, however you pronounce it. That Pokemon looked more like Squirtle, because of its tails and all that. And Blastoise was just another shellfish Pokemon, coincidentally, that actually had its own pre-evolved form called something like Blastike. And then that Pokemon and Blastoise was originally another Pokemon, Omega. Sort of. Yeah, it was reworked into Blastoise. Because the funny thing is, Omega came out first, then Blastoise. So I guess they decided to make another Pokemon that was based on it. Then they voted against Omega. And then they moved Blastoise over to the Squirtle's line, scrapped Blastoise, scrapped War Turtle's Final Evolution, real Final Evolution. And then we basically were left with, like, and then Omega was gone because it was already reworked into something else. Because, again, cartridge limitations, and they voted on it. And so... and so it's strange because you see how Pokemon kind of changed as a series, and again, because we didn't really have that much information to compare it to, like in like the original games, like we had like reasons to believe that your rival was technically supposed to be like the final battle. Well, aside from Professor Oak, of course, but he had all three starters at some point, and then. Who knows? Maybe originally you could go back and catch the original starter somewhere. Like, you could catch a Bulbasaur, you can catch a Charmander, you could catch a, what's the other one? Squirtle. Because, Professor Oak stated before, he was a trainer even for many years, and, he were some of his prized possessions, some rare Pokemon. It would make sense. Squirtles, Charmanders, and Bulbasaurs were obviously somewhere in the wild, so, they had to have been there somewhere. A sought-after creature capable of doing all sorts of crazy things. But, anyways, then it's like when Gen 2 rolled around, which Pokemon trainer actually ended up having they recycled one of the, it wasn't Blue. It wasn't Blue. Blue, I don't even know if Blue even had his starter still, did he? No, he didn't, actually. He traded it for something else. I'm trying to think. Wow, geez. It was something else entirely. Compared to his final team in the prototype, I'm just trying to think. He had some different Pokemon before you fight him in the gym leader. The Lego gym, where Giovanni was originally. But what's really interesting, though, is, but Red was obviously much stronger, so you would fight Red. And it wasn't, and then Blue took the gym leader of the final, so then they took Red and moved him into a more advanced location, so again, Mount Silver in this case. And then Red was obviously, and it made more sense, much more stronger than Blue, even though Blue was a hell of a trainer too, but Red was stronger because at that point, even 3 years, he still continued training. Blue was just like, he'll just do it at his own pace, because he already achieved what he wanted to, at least. But Red was like on his own, he never stopped, and he just kept going somehow. So anyways, Red he had all three starters. He had, a Charizard, he had a Blastoise, he had a Venusaur, and I think Ballass, was it Charizard was his first one? Yeah, it would kind of make sense. And he also had Pikachu too. So who knows? Maybe Pikachu was his original starter, but then again, he wouldn't start out with Charmander. It's kind of interesting, it's like, even though Red is like parallel universe of Ash, but, vice versa. Red came out first. And Red's obviously way stronger than Ash is. But it's interesting, because, Red has a Pikachu. He has all three starters. the first starters, and he has all sorts of crazy, like, he had Snorlax too, and he also had Lapras. Yeah, it's kind of like a nod off to the anime in some cases, because Ash actually had he had Pikachu and Lapras at one point, and obviously he still does, I think. Yeah, but you get the idea. But maybe not Lapras right now, but Lapras is somewhere else. But anyways, so basically I find it really interesting though, how they took a bunch of ideas and recycled them into something else, and it's just proof, because even when Gen 3 rolled around, and I'd say the same thing with Parxe, Parxe was scrapped, turned into Heracross, and then Heracross was in was supposed to be in his final team, Blues, and then they turned it out, and then they recycled. Blue actually had a Heracross later on in one of his. And then that would explain why Blue did have Heracross in the final version of not in Gen 2's final version, but why you would again fight your rival in a rematch in Gen 3's Fire Red and Leaf Green, and why he had a Heracross and you didn't, right offhand. I think flying types take out Heracross very easily, if I remember correctly. Yeah, I think so. But anyways, yeah. So that's just kind of something I wanted to point out. I'm not sure if anybody else might have noticed that, but that's actually pretty cool, though. You really see like how prototype data is kind of, and they moved some stuff around. Once again, some more proof there. And Heracross very well could have been, again, Parxe was Heracross, but they changed they just kind of changed it around a little bit, and then they still kind of recycled it into something else, and then they kept the idea that, hey, Blue actually had a Parxe at one point, and then they decided to turn it into Heracross, and then they brought Heracross back and gave him a Heracross at one point. So that's kind of interesting, actually, really. And I think, didn't he have a Tyranitar too? Like, I have to go back and play Pokemon Reforged. That was really the closest thing we had to the Space World demo completed. I gotta remember, what the hell was his team? Like, I know he used Blastoise, which is funny because he didn't have Blastoise in the original. Some of the Pokemon he did have were on his final team in Gen 2's final version, but not all his Pokemon were those Pokemon. They changed some of them around, and so I think he had an Umbreon too at one point, didn't he? He had Parxe, Umbreon, Executor, Blastoise. Oh yeah, now I remember. And then he had Arcanine. Didn't he have Pidgeot too? Or was it Gyarados? He had 6 Pokemon. Most of his Pokemon were his final team from the original game. Not counting the 3 starters, but it's really interesting, actually. I'll have to go. Like I said, most of it was the same. Some of it was moved around. They do it time and time again. But yeah, again, subscribe if you're not already, and I will update you on more stuff.